Welcome to the Reinventing Education podcast. I'm Rob McLeod, joined as always by Brendan O'Leary. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Joey Weisler, educator, researcher, and PhD in English, with his research area being in trauma-informed writing. He shares valuable lessons from his personal experience with trauma and burnout, and is also the host of the Classroom Narratives podcast. His work proves that storytelling can serve as a form of recovery and to empower students in the classroom. Joey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Rob and Brendan, it's so great to be here. Thank you again for the privilege of being a part of your show.
Well, we're very glad to have you here. And we want to get into your work about what you've been doing in classrooms to help students with your writing program, addressing trauma in the classroom. But I think in order for our listeners to fully understand and appreciate where this work has come from, I was wondering if you could fill us in a little bit on your background and how you came to this work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking. I'm also a university professor, and on my first day of class every semester, I normally walk into the classroom, and before I even say my name, I typically offer 3 things about myself that I want my students to know about us all being there together. The first thing that I normally like to share is that my hometown is Parkland, Florida. I'm talking to you today from North America. And Parkland, Florida, it's sad to say, but once upon a time, was a very globally known calamity because of a mass shooting that took place on Valentine's Day 2018 in our city's high school, which is also my alma mater. And in that tragedy, there were 17 people who were killed, 14 students and 3 adults. And as a substitute teacher from the city at that time, I knew some of the students who were in middle school years before, in 2016, 2017. And some of the adults were also security specialists who were around the school when I was a student there as well. And this particular tragedy spawned what became known to some as the March for Our Lives movement. And it also gained a lot of attention from other survivors of tragedies such as Sandy Hook, Newtown 2012, and Columbine in 1999. So the first time I actually ever heard of social and emotional learning and trauma-informed education was in the months following that event. It was not even something that was even really discussed on a theoretical level until that tragedy happened. The second thing that I typically like to share when I go into a classroom is that 3 months or 90 days to the day after that tragedy, I lost one of my closest high school friends very unexpectedly to an act of suicide. And being someone who was so close to this person, I still guilt myself to this day for not seeing the signs or asking the questions that maybe I could have or should have to save his life. And then the final thing about me is that when I began teaching in that first year, back in the city of Parkland, mind you, now about 120 days after the tragedy and 90 days after losing my friend to suicide, it was very, very challenging to run a classroom for the first time, seeing all of the people around me who were equally as affected by that tragedy. And honestly, I was at this middle school where I began my teaching career on the day of the shooting. And every day that I returned for that interim position was like standing on ashes and dust. And as a first year teacher, the challenges are hard enough without having that feeling. So moving over to a full-time position in 2019, I kind of went on this mission, this superhero mission, that I did not want to have blood on my hands from any of my students. I wanted to rescue them as best as I could from all of their emotional circumstances. At that time, I had a lot of my middle school students, my gifted, high-achieving, accelerated 8th grade middle school students, excavate their deepest fears to me and their deepest emotions through their writing because I invited it. And as a result of that, I quickly burned out because I realized that my heart was bleeding, but my hands were tied. And that's the way the system set itself up for me to be. And I burned out within my first year. So moving into the university space and going into the research area of trauma education, not to heal myself, but understand myself and the decisions I made in that first year, the work that I do tries to see how can we allow, especially the writing classroom, I'm the English teacher, composition teacher rather, how can we allow the writing classroom to be therapeutic for students, but not compensate for them actually getting therapy and help that they might need outside of the education space?
For those of us who've maybe heard the term trauma-informed education, could you give us some of the characteristics for someone who kind of maybe knows what that is, but maybe doesn't have a specific definition?
Definitely. Trauma-informed education means simply that you're putting the heart before the brain. You're reaching students to their hearts before you stimulate them in their mind. And when you approach them through feelings, it's getting them to still think critically, but see the world in a way that all of their senses are involved. And as you're working through their senses, you're allowing them to be trauma informed in a way that if things come up that are from the darker side of things with those students, you're allowing them to process it in safe, healthy, emotional releases. And in classes like mine, that could be through songwriting, it could be through journaling, and it could be through any sort of means that allows students to involve the whole part of themselves, or as we say in education, involving the whole child in safe and measurable ways that doesn't trigger anger or fear, but rather tries to not resolve it, but let them work through it. Trauma-informed education lets students work through emotions without the expectation that they're going to be healed by the time it's over.
These are topics that generally, as you said, aren't part of our regular curriculum. They're not central. For maybe someone who's approaching it for the first time, this may seem like an obvious question, but what are the benefits of this kind of approach?
Definitely. I'll also mention something else. So I was speaking with another scholar. He's a department chair for a university in Florida somewhere. And he said that when it comes to trauma-informed education, you want to approach it like how a doctor would to the check-in room for a patient. You want to approach it with gloves, face mask, and there's just the expectation that even if the patient looks and feels healthy, that the chances are there's still a backstory. There's still going to be something you'll want to look for to help them feel resolved. And when it comes to approaching trauma-informed education for the first time, it's just having those protocols, that knowing that there's a likelihood that every student in front of you has some sort of backstory. And the best way to do it is to come in a way that, again, doesn't upset or trigger them, but allows them to explore. Trauma-informed education is all about inviting exploration to the classroom and even letting that space become what we would call to be a contact zone. And the contact zone is just allowing this, again, the middle of the classroom just to be a space for ideas to be exchanged. And typically what I do in order to help trauma-informed education work is that I always like to have my students seated in a circle. And when they're in a circle, they can all see each other, they can validate each other, and it allows ideas to really hit the center, if you will. And part of having discussions that are very student-led, I believe that being a trauma-informed educator is synonymous to being a facilitator, where I'm not lecturing to them. I'm letting them feel like an equal to me in terms of our knowledge base. I'm the content area expert, and the students are my content area explorers. But as we explore, what we know and what we don't know about each other and our topics are pretty much on an equal basis. I'm learning things about my favorite books all the time from my students who are reading them in our circles with me. And the best way to allow students to contribute is to just constantly remind them that there are no right or wrong answers. There are just answers that are either more valid or less valid. And when students realize that, oh, well, there's really no limit to what I can share in a circle, then a lot of them feel safer to speak about it. And of course, a lot of students do not want to speak about their emotions. I just, for those who are interested, had a segment released with Dr. Adam Wolfsdorf on the Classroom Narratives podcast. And Dr. Wolfsdorf, who is a New York-based educator as well, and a scholar through the National Council of Teachers of English in the USA, he mentions that When students get this impression that they're going to be healed in the classroom, that becomes treacherous, actually, because it leads to this false idea that the classroom can heal a person. And in truth, that's not the capabilities that we have as teachers. We're not therapists. And we always need to make that clear with trauma-informed education. We are not the therapist. We have no qualifications to be one, nor do we have the proper training. But the way that the classroom can work is that through its discussion and through its formation, which just comes down to what we call to be the pedagogies of awareness, which is being present, listening, acknowledging, validating, and being visible for that conversation, are all ways to let a student continue to navigate in their own way. But again, to think that they're going to be completely healed by the time that discussion is over is just incorrect. And trauma-informed education works to overturn that mentality, to let the student know that there'll still be issues to work through by the time class is over. But at least in the moment of it, the presence and visibility from those around them and the support, of course, should be enough to help them move through that session.
Yeah, so I think you're helping to parse apart the difference between what can be therapeutic in the classroom versus what's the domain for a therapist or other help in terms of therapy.
Yes.
So how could educators or schools collaborate with mental health professionals or with other services to complement each other and to know for sure what's appropriate for the classroom and where there might be overlap or where there needs to be separation in terms of how other services or professional support could assist a classroom?
Yeah, so the first thing that we need to see is that we need to have all hands on deck. Everybody has to be on board. And by that, I mean in my first year of teaching at the middle school level, the reason why I became that superhero who, quite frankly, the way that my advisor read this in my dissertation, he's like, wow, you act like you were on a suicide mission for these kids to save them. And the reason why I became that person that the students kept coming to is because they kept saying to me, it was pretty standard across the board. They said, our social worker won't listen to us. She'll treat us like a number, but we know you'll care. And that was frightening to hear. So when I say we need all hands on board, we need to have the right people. They may have the training, but are they the right person? We need to have the right people with the right training in collaboration with the teachers like us who are on the front lines at all times. So that's the first thing, all hands on board and the right people to do that. We also need more services that are present for these students. I am delighted that at the university level, I teach at, I think, I've lost count. I'm on school number 6 or 7. I'm an adjunct professor. So as an adjunct, I'm doing multiple schools at one time. I'm doing 4 just this semester alone. And I think in my whole 5 years of part-time teaching, I think I've done maybe 7 or 8 schools in total. And again, that's like 4 a semester. And what I love about every single one of my schools that I am at, there is a very reputable and highly reliable mental health service present for everybody, students and faculty. And I think knowing that's there makes it a lot easier for when a student comes to me or when I approach them and say, hey, your paper mentions this. Are you okay? First of all, truth be told, because they know I'm that caring professor, they will be honest and say, yes, I'm okay, or no, I'm not, I need support. And at that point, it's very easy and reliable for me to escort them to the services on campus because I know once they go there, then they'll be in good hands. And we're not talking about like a one-man show department or like one-man show counselor that's running this whole university. There is a whole robust department of professionals that are a part of this team to help our students. And unfortunately, it comes down to everybody's favorite thing, funding, right? It comes down to funding as to why we do not see these at the K-12 level. But truth be told, that's where we need to pay most of our attention towards. I know that Having standard tests and standard curriculum is important to keep everybody in alignment, but most importantly, especially in this era of exiting COVID, and might I also add, only because I was a victim of one in the city, the mass shooting era, there's definitely need to be a significantly greater retention of mental health services for students. And if there's one place that the budget should be pivoted to support, it needs to be those counselors. They need more resources, less caseloads, and ways to help humanize all of the students around them.
Having that community work together. Yeah, I know from the schools I've worked in, I've been lucky to work in some schools that have put, kind of social emotional learning, given it some credence, but still to have the whole community come together, it's really challenging. What what would you say as you shifted your practice and became, more adept at this style of pedagogy? What challenges did you face along the line? I'm thinking of teachers that might follow your kind of journey. What were your challenges as you became someone who was able to support students to open up and address this sort of trauma informed pedagogy?
Yeah, there's a significant difference with that in terms of what year one and now what year six looks like. And in year one, I completely burned out because, again, I saw myself as the superhero who had one job, and that was to save all 112 of my, that's not a big number now that I think about it, but it seemed big at the time. Yeah, when you have a lot of students who are suffering, save all 112 of my students. And when I had them coming to me and investing in me, that they've been Baker acted before, they have suicidal ideation, and they're leaving me. Even one student is too much to handle with that. When you have multiple, it really builds. And quite frankly, at that time, as I was still overcoming my emotion from the tragedy or the mass shooting within the past couple months to a year, I was dealing with a lot of imposter syndrome, like severe imposter syndrome. Like, of all people, why are they coming to me? Why am I this person that they're investing in? Because I'm trying to sort things out for myself. Like, why am I the one now carrying their burdens too? And I realized it's because I invited it. I opened up that Pandora's box. So my advice to educators, what I've learned over the years, and if I could go back in time and tell myself 6 or 7 years ago, hey, you should have done this, keep Pandora's box closed. What I mean by that is, I definitely believe that it is appropriate. This is not a popular opinion, but I think it is appropriate for educators to show their vulnerabilities in front of their students. Because when you do that, it makes it so much easier for you to be humanized. We have a whole conversation on my podcast as well with others that students will not learn from teachers who they don't like, nor do they respect. It makes it much harder as a learning process. And what I found is that when I come into class and I'm like, wow, it's almost February 14th again. I'm feeling a little down today. I mean, I'm thinking about what happened last year. Does anybody else have emotions that they wanted to share, or does anybody else feel this way, right? You don't ask for their emotions, but you ask who else feels this way. And should we spend a little bit of time just fleshing through that? When you show your vulnerabilities, it lets you be a human. And when we put each other as humans first, it makes the process much better. The danger does come, however, when you open that Pandora's box, when you give them that you can tell me whatever you want signal. I'll give you exactly the moment where I know I went wrong. We were reading a novel called Of Mice and Men, John Steinbeck, and it's a story about a bunch of characters from the Great Depression, each struggling with something about being isolated. So I thought, oh, what a wonderful idea to come in middle of September. The school year is still fairly fresh. And I asked these eighth grade students, okay, we're reading Of Mice and Men. I want you to write me a journal as to how many of you have ever struggled with isolation before. It seems like an innocent question. What I was not expecting was how the students pivoted their feelings of isolation towards severe mental health crises, feelings of suicide, and how all of those instances now became a part of, again, that contact zone in the classroom. When that becomes the center, when these student crises are at the forefront and I'm the one at the front lines of that, now obviously I should have seen it. But they all turned to me and they're like, okay, now that you know this about us, what are you going to do next? And as the trope would go, I went down to administration and said, "Are you aware that students feel like," well, no, they are aware, and they do not want to be, nor do they want me to be. And that was kind of where the Pandora's box was opened, and there was no way I could get that to close. So my best advice as an educator is to do not open Pandora's box. Do not elicit emotions, or rather, solicit emotion. Yes, solicit or elicit emotions from students that could cause for unwarranted means. Because again, if they do come forward and say, "I'm feeling this or that," you need to know that you do not have the training to actually follow through as the educator. So I wish I knew to keep that closed. Moving forward, what I've learned is that, again, students are invited to share ideas, but never required. And something that I've done going forward in my own classrooms is that, of course, I use the rubric. The rubric is a very standard tool to know or help students show how they're going to be graded. But what I've also done is that I sit the students in their circles and only require them to speak if they want to. What that does is that there's two ways that you can do work in a class like mine. You can be a part of the conversation and talk it out, which is ideal, or you can listen. And if you listen, you're going to go away and do my writing assignment. So there's always a writing assignment, but if they talk it out during class, they don't have to do the writing because their ideas have been shared. I know what they would be saying. So that gives students flexibility and choice. So what I would tell a trauma-informed educator to do is to have flexibility and choice for your students. And when you show that dynamic in front of you, use the rubric with it. Grade to your rubric. If a student comes forward and talks about their deepest emotional instances on paper, well, that's fine, but does it align to the rubric? Have a conversation with them and don't give the student an A just because they shared X, Y, and Z. I acknowledge it as a comment, but say, let's bring this back to our text. Let's talk about what the rubric looks like. If we're reading, oh gosh, this week we're reading The Hate U Give, for example. I'm teaching it today in a couple hours. When we're reading The Hate U Give, sure, there's a lot of violence. There's trauma, there's grief. If a student tries to personalize that, not a problem. Take a quote from the book. Tell me how this connects to our main character from the text. And when you help students use emotion in a way that ties back to the curriculum, that's the best way to be trauma informed, because now it's not all about them, like it's not all about their emotions, but rather it becomes an emotional investment to the curriculum.
For someone who's inspired hearing what you're describing here in terms of these practices, kind of two questions at the same time. One, can you share a little bit more, Joey, about some of the resources that you've developed, your website, things like that, where people can turn to you to get more information, or to suggested sources that you would point people to, or even perhaps specific podcast episodes of yours?
Yes.
And then second, to if we zoom out from our own classroom practices to like a school-wide approach, what can schools do to organize structures or communities or collaborate on certain approaches to offer a whole school approach to this with a classroom nestled inside of that whole school approach?
Excellent question. Thank you for that. First of all, I definitely invite our listeners here today to visit my website, which I hope Rob and Brendan will put into the show notes, perhaps. It's josephweisler.com. And on my website, you'll see a couple different handouts and projects that I'm working with as well. One of them is my trauma-informed teaching guide, which again really emphasizes the work that we're doing here as trauma-informed educators, which frankly is to just be present. And it starts with being a good human. I'll start with that. Trauma-informed education just starts with being a kind human for students and for each other, for your colleagues as well. And when it comes to my personal projects, I'm currently working on the Classroom Narratives podcast. That's a newer one. And in the Classroom Narratives podcast, it's about wellness stories in education. I have spoken with several leaders, several students, educators, even politicians, and survivors of other school tragedies who have all come together to speak about what trauma-informed education looks like. And for excellent episodes about this, I would recommend Dr. Adam Wolfsdorf on Navigating the English Classroom, or I think it's called Beyond the Text, just released on March 12th of this year. And I would also point students, or rather our listeners, towards Jen Rafferty's conversation on the superhero narrative. I believe that was released in November 2024. And I'm also currently working on The Throne in the Classroom. And The Throne in the Classroom is a biopic. A biopic means it's a biographical image, or rather a reenactment of a certain experience. We see these a lot in Hollywood, and especially for American Hollywood films. We constantly see films of teachers who really struggle. And can I give you a little secret? It's always the writing teacher. Every single time. It's the English teacher, with one exception, called Stand and Deliver. He was a calculus teacher, so he does not fit this mold. But in every other time, it's always the writing teacher. It's always the literature educator who finds themselves at the forefront of just these horrific moments in dealing with students with their therapy. And I call it horrific because they didn't sign up for it. That's what I mean. They did not sign up for what they encountered. And these educators in films such as The Freedom Writers, starring Hilary Swank as Erin Gruwell, Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams as John Keating. There's Dangerous Minds with Michelle Pfeiffer playing the role of Luann Johnson, and even The Ron Clark Story with Matthew Perry playing the role of educator Ron Clark. Those are all real life North American educators, every single one of them. And I'm currently working on a series that tries to do the same in terms of thinking about what is it like to be a first-year teacher. Again, that's traumatic enough, being a first-year teacher. But in the months following a mass tragedy, interpersonal tragedy, and when you step into that classroom, how do you untangle all of those events to still make the moments matter? So The Throne in the Classroom, which is a narrative, will start to set the foundation as to what that could look like from the entertainment perspective. As for schools and leaderships, again, my message would be involve the whole. It's about everybody, right? If you leave out your teachers, or if you leave out the students, even if you leave out the parents, you're not going to get the whole picture. We're a circle, we're a chain, we're all connected. The students report to the teachers report to the leaders report to the superintendent reports to the community, and the community serves the students. So in a way, we are all a circle. No one has more power than the other, and the grand scheme of that circle is just an ongoing dynamic that can only survive if everybody takes the time to stop, listen, acknowledge, and say, how can I help? What do you need? And follow through with that on all levels.
Again, this idea that the whole community being involved. So how do we deal with pushback or people who may be skeptical of this approach, whether they're students, parents, administrators? What strategies have you employed to kind of, bring people further into this approach and to see why it's so valuable?
There's always going to be pushback, absolutely. And the problem is that trauma exists in the real world, but we try and hide away from it as best we can. When trauma comes to us head on, we normally try and say, oh, this isn't really happening. It's not there. We like to live within our own bubbles. But in the classroom, inevitably, for example, in the literature class, we do seek out trauma quite a bit. Because if you think about it, history is traumatic. World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, many, many topics in social science are traumatic. And to speak about it any differently misses the point of it. Stories are very traumatic. If you read a novel and there is not some climatic element that doesn't keep your attention, it's not really a story. Literature is also traumatic. So curriculum, whether deliberate or not, is always seeking out trauma, even though, again, there's that paradox that does exist in the real world. So the research should allow the community to know that this is what we deal with in the classrooms. It's here, and we need to just acknowledge its presence. You cannot sanitize it either, because when you sanitize it, it's going to make people think that nobody cares. So the best way to follow through is to just know that it's here. It's not going anywhere. In fact, there's going to be more of it, especially now that we are entering such a polarized time, significantly here in the US and around the world as well. It's only going to become more prevalent. I wouldn't say extreme, but certainly much more prevalent, to the point that we need to emphasize those pedagogies of awareness, which is, again, the pedagogies of awareness: being present, listening, acknowledging, supporting, helping. We need to be all in as a community to ensure that we can get schools and communities the help that they need in order to become more trauma informed. To shy away from it or to even try and push back is going to be destructive rather than constructive to helping the schools continue to thrive.
This idea of the pressures that are inside our schools, and you talked about standardized testing and adherence to the curriculum, and we feel that as educators, regardless of what type of school we're in, it's there. And so I think the philosophical approach that you just described is would get us quite a long way into persuading people why this is a meaningful approach. But how, on the more practical level, of the teachers who are like, well, I can't really spend much time on this because I've got so much content to cover and I need to make sure that my kids are going to score well on the tests. And it's like, so we're just going to have to kind of compromise on that aspect. We might do the odd day or the odd activity, but I can't put it central because of all of these other pressures. How might you speak to those teachers who do value it for sure, but these other pressures maybe are weighing on them?
Definitely. And let me also be clear, Brendan, that when I say that trauma is not going anywhere, unfortunately, neither is the test. Those two things are both always going to be in our classrooms, and the most effective educators will determine for themselves how to manage both. And what I do believe in standards, of course, but what I think it's very tricky was when the standard becomes the script, where by Tuesday, everybody needs to be teaching page 42 and it needs to look exactly like that. And the common planning needs to be across the same with no free thinking. That's where I think it gets very complicated. And I think that schools should pivot away from that and allows educators to interpret the standards how they wish and execute their own vision. When it comes to social and emotional learning, however, it's less even about how the content is taught, but rather how the classroom itself continues to work. For example, building people skills, allowing students to be a part of a conversation, look at each other in the eye, acknowledgement, right? So for teachers that are tepid about trying to tie in these feelings, if you will, right, in alignment with the curriculum, it's less about causing feelings, but rather just bringing out human qualities of a classroom, which is just letting students be students or letting kids be kids. And when they're able to practice everyday interpersonal skills in the classroom, that enough can compensate for what social and emotional learning can become while still meeting the standards.
Yeah, and I like that you're giving some very practical examples of ways for students to interact and the benefits that come along with that. I'm curious, like if we try and become friends with the curriculum and all those expectations, are there curriculums or approaches that you've seen that do take like a wider, that try to merge, these social emotional learning, the trauma informed alongside these standards? Like, have you seen any systems with, like a great math, science, social studies, PE, everything merged together through this lens, or advice for schools that maybe do collaborate on this level of wanting a shared school-wide approach to learning?
Yeah, to be quite frank, I haven't seen any whole level work at the moment, but what I have certainly acknowledged is that it is significantly more challenging for our STEM courses, science, technology, engineering, math, It's not impossible, but it is significantly more harder to have emotion invested into the curriculum because they're so formulaic. I chuckle because the number one question that I ask in English, like if somebody says something and I don't know how to respond, which happens quite a bit, my default question will be, okay, so how does that make you feel? And that alone can let the conversation go on for several more minutes. That's my favorite question, and it's the easiest question. Okay, how does that comment make you feel? Who has a response to that? What do we think about that? And unfortunately, in math, where y equals mx plus b, there's nothing to think about that. It's practical. It's the truth. Or when you say that, the cell is the mitochondria of the whatever, like that's just the fact. So it's significantly harder in science and STEM to allow emotional learning to take place. So again, I'll say that in classes like that, it's easier just to allow people skills to come out. Maybe it's doing very small group work or solving equations with peers, right? And allowing students to become interpersonal. If the content is not interpersonal, like how it would be in English, then at least the delivery of the content in a math or a science class should welcome interpersonal skills for students to build each other. So when we talk about collaborating between the core subjects, it's not about every topic needs to be an emotional investment, but it should at least allow the students to be humans. And again, when you allow them to be humans, that's teaching to the heart over the mind. You know why so many students hate school? Because they know that for 7.5 hours, 5 days a week, that's 35 plus, again, I'm not a math person, 7.5 times 5, that's more than 35, almost 40 hours a week, maybe like 37. They are going to be overstimulated to their mind. That's exhausting, even just to say that. No wonder why students have the Sunday scaries, right? Because they know what's coming. And when you flip that script and say, it's going to be 37 hours this week for them being touched to their heart and allow them to practice being people, I would say you would find a lot more students that appreciate what education looks like. Because I was talking with my twin brother. We're going to be 30 in a few weeks. I was talking with my twin brother recently, and he was like, wow, what a great time that was. He hated school, but he's like, what a great time that was. I got to go, I got to sit, I got to be with my peers and my friends, and that's all I had to do. I'd be like, that was life. I'm like, there was more than that. We had 9 tests a week, and you were taught to your mind for 37 hours. But yeah, it should be an excellent opportunity to let a childhood happen and just get to know. I mean, we call it a school because it's supposed to teach students about the world. And what better way for them to just practice interpersonal communication? So that will be my advice for all subjects, to just let the students be humans first. And when you see them grow and care as people, then the content will become almost automatic.
Yeah, we've talked about this using some of our language of the 3 types of school, that it's really when we move to that third type, the counselor approach to education, that the school actually values you bringing your whole self, which I think ties together a lot of the threads you've discussed here today about, showing your vulnerabilities, expressing how you feel, sharing reactions to things, being present with people, listening, active inquiry, all of those things, because the expert and the coach classrooms, all 3 of these approaches having their strengths and weaknesses, but the expert and coach, it's a little bit more like, hey, there's things that we need you to get done, and some parts of you are inconvenient to us being able to accomplish that. Whereas the counselor is the one that says, oh, no, we've got stuff to do, and you're a whole person, and all of you is welcome here. On the student level, that is welcome. On the teacher level, on the staff level, parent level, you don't have to edit yourself. Of course, you do to some degree in every interpersonal interaction, but sure, we're not asking for a consistent editing of who you are in order for us to be able to carry out our function. More of a comment than a question, but maybe I'll just throw that to both Joey and Brendan.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that if I were to come up with a takeaway from today's conversation, involve the whole person. And I say person because I'm talking about the child, I'm talking about the teacher, I'm talking about the principal. Involve the whole person. I've noticed that, especially now at the college level, we are actually even more prone to seeing the facilitator, which Robin, Brendan, I know that was your fourth classification of people. We're starting to really value the facilitator, where we are in an era now, 5 years after COVID and 4 years after schools came back. There has been this pendulum sway, if you will, where people don't want to be lectured to anymore. They don't want to be talked at, especially where I am at the college level. I was actually told by a couple of different search committees, are like, yeah, you will fail if you think of yourself as the lecturer. Like, you will be gone very quickly because students will not like that and they will give you low ratings. And we like to retain professors who have a good rapport with their students. So we like to see the facilitator, because when you are the facilitator, you come in and you say, I'm human, you're human. Now everybody sit and let's have a conversation. And that's the way education works best, where again, you involve the whole person because everybody has a chance to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point that I'm getting from the conversation as well is that therapeutic versus therapy. And I think that is something I've come across in myself and with many teachers along the way of knowing where that line is. And as you said, burnout comes if you are trying to be that therapist inside the classroom. Yeah, at the risk of me asking you to repeat yourself, I don't think I am, but just if you can dig in a little bit more into how we, like, as a teacher, I'm primary age, but upper primary, maybe kids are 10, 11, 12 years old. How can I have a therapeutic classroom, but really avoid those pitfalls and notice if I'm starting to drift into being a therapist?
Definitely. And again, it's about having that sense of awareness where you know that every student has a backstory, but you don't pressure them to share it with you. It's about inviting, not soliciting. When I did that activity with the mice and men, where I asked my eighth graders to talk about when they felt like an outsider, I got some of their darkest, I got some of the darkest parts of themselves. I didn't heal anybody. They didn't feel healed. They know that. I know that. And it caused me to burn out. I left that classroom by Christmas. And I think when you come in with the expectation that the content will heal you, no, the content will never heal you, but rather the discussions can help students work through their circumstances. And where I went wrong is that I don't think I gave my students a chance to work through it. I wanted them to just be healed without doing the work. And that's when the classroom, I'm using this word very loosely, but that's when it can become dangerous. You expect the emotions to work themselves out. Now, I could be wrong, but I think that in the K to maybe 5 lower grades era, students might be a lot less likely to censor themselves, I think. But when you get older and students become more self-aware, I think that they may really, really choose to censor what they want to share. So then when they do share different tendencies that they have, that's when it becomes so important, because they may not share that with everybody. But what I've learned to do is to not go into panic mode and sound the alarms at the first encounter. The best way to do, or rather handle, instances where that classroom is blurring the lines is to remember that you are the teacher. It's the first thing I wish I remembered. I was not the therapist. Remember that you are the teacher. If a student has shared something with you, whether it's in writing or in conversation or just in general, the best thing to do is to just reapproach them, hopefully in that same conversation, and just say, hey, I recognize that you said this, or you feel this, or you wrote this. I'm here to learn more. Can you tell me how I can help you? When you flip that conversation to what's wrong with you versus how can I support you, it sets an entirely different dynamic. So being visible is the first thing that I would encourage teachers to do. Be visible and listen. And then from there, if the student wants to move forward to receive additional services, then pass them along to mental health services. But I like to think of myself, I have training in something called ASSIST. It's called Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. And the number one thing that I need to remember from my training, which again, I regret that I kind of neglected that part of it when I was teaching middle school, is that I am not the last person of contact. My job is to be the CPR lifeline for mental health, as all teachers are capable of. You're the lifeline that is simply the eyes and ears that keep the student safe for now until they are passed on to the expert. So that's my advice for every teacher, to remember that you are not the therapist, but you are someone who can keep that student safe for now as you escort them to the person who can be the therapist.
Absolutely. And I remember when I started doing journaling with my class and totally just opened up that Pandora's box and just, you know, yeah, thankfully we did have a good team with counselor and so on, but yeah, what I would say is, if someone's listening to this now and they'd like to, try some practical activities in their classroom, and I know the way you've described it, it's you're using quite the kind of activities that we'd see in an English classroom, but you're just kind of adapting them slightly to give more scope for this trauma-informed education. But is there a couple of things I might take into my classroom tomorrow that I could begin to try that would start to move me in that direction, or is it a little bit broader than that?
It could be broader, but I would say the best thing that you can do before you actually start adjusting your content is to adjust your students' interpersonal relationships with each other. Tomorrow, when you walk into class, have them sit in a circle to start with. And when they're in their circles, pose a debatable question or something that they can talk about in groups while looking at each other and listening to each other and validating each other. Give your students a chance to speak. Give them a chance to listen. And when you allow them to actually have those relationships with each other, then they'll turn to you and say, oh, Mr. O'Leary knows what he's doing now. He always has, but now he knows how to help us build our interpersonal relationships with ourselves and our class. So that would be my advice, to let the students focus on themselves. And once they know what they're all about, then the content will just kind of automatically flow its way in. And they'll see you as the facilitator or somebody who can help them find their journey through the material.
Yeah, that's great. And those kind of, in my particular approach, we kind of call them transdisciplinary skills, the ones that go over all of our subjects about, your own interpersonal and your self-management, your communication skills. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very good advice, I think.
Again, because if our math teacher's listening, they're probably saying, well, I'm teaching the quadratic formula tomorrow, and x will still equal negative b plus or minus square root. Yes, that's right. It still will. But when you're discussing that, again, structure the classroom. Just start with the actual climate. Structure it in a way that allows students to see, hear, support, listen, acknowledge, and even get a discussion going. And for math, when it's factual and numeric, maybe have them solve an equation together and talk about how they got to their response. I had a conversation with Rob Durant on the show. It's coming out in April. And what he said is that for a classroom like math, geometry was one of my challenging subjects because it was being taught to my mind. It wasn't being taught to the heart. It was being taught to the mind, because that's just how geometry was. Rob Durant says that when it comes to understanding, for example, proofs in algebra or proofs in geometry, your GPS does the same thing. You type an address into your GPS and it shows where you want to go, and it needs to come up with the path as to how you're going to get there. And he started a discussion with that amongst his students. So find ways to make the conversations practical in all of your classes, even if it's chem or math. There's something about it that's always going to be a practicality. The students unfortunately, may not remember it by the time they're 30, but at least it'll help them make sense at that time. And when you sway, again, the mentality of being taught directly to the brain to being connected through the heart, while forming interpersonal relationships in the classroom. That is a structure that any subject area can achieve and benefit from.
Just before we get ready to wrap up today, can you remind us again where people can engage with your work? We'll include links in the show description for this episode for listeners. And is there anything perhaps that we haven't touched on that you would have liked to have said, or closing thoughts?
I thought today's conversation was extremely productive, so thank you for that. And on my website, you can have access to the Classroom Narratives podcast. There is also the Thrown in the Classroom biopic. We have a couple different narrative segments. One is a short film, and by short, I mean a 12-minute short film that actually encounters it. You will see through like short film format what it actually was like to do that of mice and men activity and how the students came forward and what they shared. Our goal is to pitch this to different networks, right? And maybe on one of your streaming services in the future, come on back in a few years and you'll actually see a fully developed series. I'm very, very excited for that. And also there is an abstract for those that are very curious to learn more from my dissertation, which I call From Scars into Stars, Transforming the Pain of Trauma into Purpose in Academic Writing. And I typically use that tagline in my class quite a bit, Scars into Stars. At my friend's funeral in 2018, that was what the pastor mentioned in his sermon, that although my friend had passed of suicide, we could still take whatever scars he was feeling and transfer it into stars. And quite frankly, that's all I've done for my whole career, including during my PhD program. So what I also would advise teachers is to know that every day is that opportunity to help students transform their scars into stars, their pain into purpose. And it doesn't have to be through letting them bleed through their wounds onto a page, but it can rather just be through allowing them to be humans and connect with each other.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.